At my son's wedding, his wife said, "Starting tomorrow, you're no longer part of this family. Now I'm number one in your son's life." I just smiled and canceled my $80,000 payment. In the morning, Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. Some people say you don't truly know someone until you've sat across from them at a dinner table. I'd add to that, you don't truly know your daughter-in-law until she decides, on her wedding day, that you're no longer worth keeping. My name is Margaret Callahan. Most people call me Peggy. I'm 68 years old, a retired school principal, and for the better part of 4 decades, I poured everything I had into one thing: my family. My husband, Robert, passed away 11 years ago from a heart condition that gave us only 3 weeks of warning. After he was gone, it was just me and Daniel, my son, my boy, the kid who used to fall asleep on the couch with his sneakers still on and his homework half finished on the coffee table. We weren't just mother and son. We were a team. I want to be clear about something before I go any further. I am not the kind of woman who clings. I knew Daniel would marry someday. I wanted him to. When he called me in the spring of 2021 and said, "Mom, I met someone," I felt nothing but warmth. I had a good house, good friends, a garden I loved, and enough sense to understand that a grown man's life was his own to build. But then I met Brianna. She came to Thanksgiving that first year. Polished, pretty, with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. She brought a bottle of expensive wine and complimented my kitchen twice. Daniel looked at her the way people look at things they're afraid to lose. I told myself I was imagining things. I told myself I was one of those mothers. The first real signal came in January of 2022. Daniel and I had a standing Sunday phone call. Nothing formal, just habit, something we'd done for years. One Sunday, he didn't call. I didn't think much of it. The next Sunday, same thing. When I finally reached him on a Tuesday evening, his voice was different. Careful, like he was reading from a script someone else had written. He told me Brianna felt that our weekly calls were a bit much, and that he thought it made sense to give her some space to feel settled. Give her space. In my son's relationship. That was how she phrased it. I let it go. People adjust when they enter new relationships. I understood that. But the adjustments kept coming. I was no longer invited to their apartment for casual dinners, only for planned visits, scheduled 2 weeks in advance. Daniel stopped mentioning me in conversation when Brianna was in the room. Small things, the kind of things you can't point to without sounding paranoid. Her mother, Karen Holt, entered the picture around that summer. Karen was a sharp-tongued woman from Connecticut who wore her ambitions for her daughter like a second outfit. She had opinions about everything: where Daniel and Brianna should live, what kind of wedding they should have, what financial decisions they should make. And gradually, quietly, those opinions started sounding like instructions. By the time Daniel announced their engagement in the fall of 2022, I had learned to read the shape of what was happening, even if I couldn't yet name it. I offered to contribute to the wedding. I offered generously. $80,000, which was money Robert and I had set aside years ago for exactly this kind of moment. A down payment on a future. A gift from a father who never got to give it himself. Daniel accepted with tears in his eyes. Brianna accepted with a nod and a smile that I was beginning to understand very well. The wedding was in June, a Saturday. The venue was a restored estate outside of Portland, Oregon. Brianna's choice, Karen's influence, Daniel's signature on the contract. It was beautiful, I'll give her that. White flowers everywhere, string lights, a string quartet during cocktail hour. I wore a navy dress that Robert would have liked. I danced with my son during the mother-son song and held on a little longer than was probably graceful, because I already felt, somewhere deep in my chest, that something was ending. The reception was winding down. The speeches were done. I was standing near the edge of the tent, holding a glass of champagne I hadn't really been drinking, when Brianna appeared at my elbow. She didn't look drunk. She didn't look emotional. She looked deliberate. She leaned in close enough that only I could hear her and said very clearly, "Starting tomorrow, you're no longer part of this family. Daniel is mine now. You come second. Actually, you don't come at all." I looked at her. I looked at my son across the room, laughing with someone from his office, completely unaware. And I smiled. Not because I was fine. Not because it didn't hurt. It hurt the way only certain things hurt. The slow spreading kind, like cold water filling a room. I smiled because I am 68 years old, and I have survived things Brianna Holt has never had to imagine, and because in that moment, standing in my navy dress on my son's wedding night, I made a very quiet, very calm decision. I took out my phone, I opened my banking app, and I canceled the scheduled transfer of $80,000. She would find out in the morning. I didn't sleep that night. I drove back to my hotel room. I'd booked a single room 2 miles from the estate because Brianna had made it clear that the post-wedding brunch the next morning was immediate family only, a category that apparently no longer included me. And I sat on the edge of the bed in my navy dress for a long time before I found the energy to change. The room was quiet. Outside, Portland was doing what Portland does in June. A soft rain had started, tapping against the window with the kind of patience that makes you feel very alone. I thought about Robert. I thought about what he would have said. He was a practical man, not cold, but grounded. He would have poured me a glass of something, sat down across from me, and said, "Peggy, what do you actually know? And what are you assuming?" It was the question he always asked me when I was running ahead of the facts. So I sat there and I made myself answer it honestly. What did I actually know? I knew that Brianna had said those words to me. I knew that I had heard them clearly, that I had not misunderstood them or taken them out of context. She had been composed and deliberate. This was not a slip of the tongue from someone who had too much champagne. This was a statement of intent. I knew that over the past 18 months, my access to my son had been slowly, methodically reduced. The Sunday calls, the planned only visits, the way his voice changed when she was in the room. I had cataloged all of it in the back of my mind without letting myself fully look at it, the way you avoid looking directly at something that frightens you. I knew that $80,000 had been accepted without a word of genuine gratitude, accepted as an expectation, not a gift. And I knew that Daniel did not know any of this was happening, or perhaps more accurately, I knew that Daniel had chosen, in the way that loving and somewhat weak people sometimes choose, not to see it. That was the part that hurt most, not Brianna. I had met women like Brianna before. Calculating, territorial, convinced that love was a resource to be managed and controlled. They existed, they caused damage, and sometimes they overplayed their hand. But my son had watched me be edged out of his life one Sunday phone call at a time and had told himself it was compromise. I changed out of my dress. I washed my face. I made bad hotel coffee and drank it at the small desk by the window while the rain continued outside. By morning, the fear had done what fear eventually does when you refuse to feed it. It settled into something quieter, something harder. I have spent 40 years working with people, students, parents, staff members, school board members who thought intimidation was a management strategy. I know what it feels like when someone is trying to make you smaller, and I know that the moment you start shrinking is the moment you hand them everything they wanted. I was not going to shrink, but I also wasn't going to act rashly. That was important. Rash action was what Brianna expected, a hurt, emotional mother-in-law making scenes, sending accusatory texts, calling Daniel in tears. That was the script she had written for me, and playing it would only confirm whatever story she had already told him about me. I needed to be deliberate, methodical. I needed to think about what I actually wanted. So I sat there with my bad coffee and I thought about it carefully. What did I want? I wanted my son back. Not in a possessive way. I wanted him to see clearly what was being done to him. Brianna wasn't just isolating him from me. She was reshaping him. The careful voice. The pre-approved visits. These were not the habits of a man in a loving partnership. These were the habits of a man who had learned to manage consequences. I wanted the money handled properly, not as leverage. I wasn't interested in using $80,000 as a weapon. But that money had been Robert's dream as much as mine. It deserved to go somewhere that honored that. It was not going to fund a life in which I didn't exist. And I wanted, if it was possible, for none of this to destroy Daniel. Because whatever happened next, he was still my son, and I still loved him. That fact was not negotiable. By the time I checked out of the hotel that Sunday morning, the outline of a plan had taken shape in my mind. It wasn't complete. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet and careful, like most things that actually work. First, documentation. I needed to write down exactly what Brianna had said, exactly when and where, while it was still fresh. Not for any legal purpose, at least not yet, but because truth has a way of getting blurry when powerful emotions are involved, and I needed to stay anchored to what was real. Second, I needed to speak to Tom Griffin, my family attorney, about the money. Not to demand it back. No transfer had gone through. But to understand clearly where I stood and what my options were. Third, and most carefully, I needed to find a way to reach Daniel, not immediately, not emotionally, but eventually, and on ground that Brianna couldn't control. I drove home to my house in Salem, Oregon, the same house where Daniel had grown up, the same porch where Robert used to drink his morning coffee. And I felt something settle in my chest that I hadn't expected to feel that morning. Clarity. Tom Griffin had been my family's attorney for 19 years. He was a quiet, careful man who wore the same style of reading glasses he'd worn since I first met him, and who had a habit of listening to everything you said before responding to any of it. Robert had trusted him completely. I trusted him the same way. I called his office Monday morning and asked for an urgent appointment. His assistant, who knew me by name, gave me a slot the following Wednesday. I spent the 2 days in between doing what I'd decided to do, writing. I sat at Robert's old desk in the study, the room with the bookshelves and the window that looked out over the back garden, and I wrote down everything I could remember. Not just the moment at the reception, though I recorded that in detail. The time, approximately 9:45 in the evening, the location near the eastern edge of the tent, the exact words Brianna had used, the tone, the fact that she had leaned in so that no one else could hear. I also wrote down the 18 months of smaller events, the Sunday calls that ended, the shift in Daniel's manner of speaking, the way Karen Holt had started appearing in more and more of their joint decisions. Small things, each one defensible in isolation, but forming a pattern when laid side by side. Writing it down was more useful than I'd expected. It forced precision. It prevented me from catastrophizing or softening. It was simply what had happened in order, with dates where I had them. Wednesday morning, I drove to Tom's office in downtown Salem. It was a warm day, clear sky, the kind of morning that has no interest in matching your interior weather. I told Tom everything. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the things I valued most about him. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he asked me what outcome I was hoping for. I told him what I'd told myself in the hotel room. I wanted my son to see clearly. I wanted the money, which had never been transferred, to remain under my control until I understood what I was dealing with. And I wanted to know whether anything that had happened had legal implications I should be aware of. Tom's assessment was measured. The money was straightforward. Since I had canceled the transfer before it processed, the funds were still mine. There was no obligation. The gift had been verbal and conditional on good faith. He advised me to make sure I had the cancellation confirmation in writing from my bank, which I did. He also told me, gently, that what I was describing in terms of Brianna's behavior was consistent with a pattern that family court professionals sometimes called spousal isolation, the systematic reduction of a partner's outside relationships. It was not, in most cases, a legal matter unless it rose to the level of coercive control. But it was real. It was documented in psychological literature, and it was worth keeping a record of. I left his office feeling steadier. That afternoon, my phone buzzed. It was Daniel. "Mom." His voice was tight, controlled in the way it got when he was upset, but trying not to show it. "I just wanted to check in and see how you're feeling after the wedding." I knew what this was. I said I was feeling well and asked how he was. "I'm fine," he said. "Bree mentioned that you two had a conversation at the reception. She said it got a little tense. She's concerned that things might have been misunderstood." I want you to understand what that sentence did to me. Not because it surprised me. By then, very little was surprising me. But because of its architecture. Brianna was concerned. Things might have been misunderstood. She had already gotten to him. She had already placed herself in the role of the worried, confused party, and she had framed me, implicitly, as the source of the tension. I kept my voice even. I told Daniel I'd had a very clear conversation with Brianna and that I hadn't misunderstood anything. I told him I loved him. I told him I thought it would be good if the two of us spoke in person, soon. Just the two of us. There was a pause. Then he said he'd have to check with Brianna about their schedule. He'd have to check with Brianna. I said that was fine and that I'd be here whenever he was ready. After I hung up, I sat in my garden for a while. The roses Robert planted the year Daniel was born were blooming. They always bloomed late. He'd chosen a late variety deliberately. Something about wanting flowers when everyone else's had faded. My phone buzzed again. This time, it was a number I didn't recognize. I answered it. "Mrs. Callahan." Karen Holt's voice. Smooth, practiced, with an edge underneath it that she wasn't quite bothering to hide. "I think we should talk about the gift you mentioned to Daniel and Brianna. They were expecting the funds to arrive this week." There it was. Not "how are you" after the wedding. Not "was everything all right." The money. That was the first call. That was the priority. I told Karen, pleasantly, that I'd need some time to review a few things and that I'd be in touch. "Review what exactly?" she asked. "Just some details," I said. The silence on her end lasted exactly long enough to tell me that Karen Holt was not accustomed to being given that kind of answer. "I see," she said finally. "Well, don't take too long." I thanked her for calling and ended the call. I looked at the roses. I thought about the fact that Karen Holt had called me, not Brianna, not Daniel, to ask about money. Within 4 days of the wedding, while her daughter was still on her honeymoon, and I thought, there it is. That was my first direct evidence. Not of cruelty, not of malice. Those I'd already witnessed. This was evidence of the thing that ran underneath all of it. The financial strategy. The $80,000 had never been a gift to Daniel and Brianna. It had been a target. And Karen Holt had just confirmed it by not waiting even 1 week before making contact. I went inside, opened my notebook, and wrote down the call. Date, time, content, exact phrasing. Don't take too long. I underlined it. The first part of my plan was simple. I scheduled a lunch with Daniel, just Daniel, on a Thursday, at a restaurant we'd been going to since he was a teenager. A place called Harlow's on the north side of Salem, with booths in the back and a waitress named Greta who had known us for years. I didn't tell him what I wanted to discuss. I didn't tell Brianna at all. He arrived 10 minutes late, which wasn't like him. When he came through the door, he looked tired, the slightly hollowed look of a man running on vigilance rather than sleep. I waited until we'd ordered before I said anything of substance. Then I put my notebook on the table and I told him what I needed to tell him. Not emotionally, not as a grievance. I laid out a sequence of events. The Sunday calls that ended. The way visits became scheduled appointments. Karen's phone call 4 days after the wedding. And finally, clearly and precisely, what Brianna had said to me at the reception. Daniel was quiet through most of it. When I finished, he stared at his coffee for a long time. "Mom," he said, "Brianna said you approached her at the reception. She said you made some comments about her needing to earn her place in our family." I looked at my son, my gentle, trusting boy. "Daniel," I said, "does that sound like something I would say?" He didn't answer right away. That pause told me more than any answer would have. I told him I wasn't asking him to choose sides. I wasn't asking him to do anything except take the time to think about what he knew to be true. About me, about our history, about the pattern of the last 18 months. I told him the money was still mine and would stay mine until I felt comfortable with how things stood. I told him I loved him unconditionally and that none of that had changed. He left lunch looking shaken. I sat in the booth for a while after he was gone, ordered a slice of pie I didn't eat, and let myself feel the weight of it. By Friday morning, the response had arrived. Brianna called me directly. This was new. She had always preferred to route her communications through Daniel, or apparently through Karen. The fact that she was calling me herself told me the lunch had rattled something. Her voice was not the quiet, controlled one she'd used at the reception. There was pressure underneath it. "I don't know what you said to Daniel yesterday," she began, "but I need you to understand something. We are married. What you're doing, withholding that money, planting doubts, it's manipulation, and it's not going to work. If you keep this up, we will get a lawyer involved, and we will make sure Daniel understands exactly what kind of mother he has." I let her finish. Then I said, "Brianna, I canceled a bank transfer. That's not manipulation. That's my legal right. And if you'd like to involve lawyers, I already have one. You have no idea. I have Tom Griffin's card in my wallet," I said. "You're welcome to call him." She hung up. An hour later, Daniel called. And this was the hardest call of all, because his voice had Brianna's fingerprints all over it, the careful phrasing, the formal distance. He said that he was deeply hurt by my actions, and that if I was going to treat his wife this way, he wasn't sure how we were going to move forward. I told him I understood he was hurt. I told him I was sorry for any pain this was causing him. I told him that I loved him, that the door of my house was always open, and that I hoped, when things were quieter, he would be willing to sit down with me again. I did not apologize for canceling the transfer. Saturday morning, Karen Holt appeared at my front door. I want to be fair here. She didn't bang on it or make a scene. She knocked firmly and stood on my porch with the expression of a woman who had spent her life solving problems through sheer force of presence. "Margaret," she said, "I think we can settle this like adults." I invited her in because I was not going to have this conversation on my front porch for the neighbors to see. I made coffee because I am from a generation that makes coffee for guests even when the guests are the problem. Karen sat at my kitchen table and told me with great precision what she believed the situation was. She said that I was a grieving widow who had never properly let go of her son. She said that Brianna was a wonderful woman who deserved a husband whose mother respected her. She said that the $80,000 had already been factored into plans. There were contractors, there was a deposit, there were commitments made, and that my pulling it back was not just hurtful, but financially disruptive. I listened to all of it. Then I said, "Karen, your daughter told me at the reception that I was no longer part of this family. I wrote it down that night. I have the date, the time, and the exact words. What I don't have is an acknowledgement of that." Karen's expression shifted. Brianna was emotional. She wasn't emotional, I said. She was very calm. The silence in my kitchen was long and specific. Karen left without her settlement. As she walked down my front path, she said, and I think she meant it as a warning, You're making this harder than it needs to be." I closed the door and leaned against it for a moment, with my eyes shut. I had held my ground. I had not wavered. But I was tired in a way that went down to the bone. I called my friend Linda Parker that afternoon and told her I needed a few days. Linda, who had known me since our children were in grade school together, said simply, "Come to the coast. I have the cabin until next weekend." So I packed a bag, told Tom I'd be reachable by phone, and drove to the Oregon coast. 3 days of salt air and long walks, and not answering calls from numbers I didn't want to answer. 3 days of remembering who I was before any of this had started. The Oregon coast in summer smells like cold salt and pine resin, and something that has no name, but which I have always associated with the particular relief of arriving somewhere honest. Linda's cabin sat on a bluff above the beach, small and weathered, with a deck that faced west so you could watch the sun drop into the Pacific every evening if you wanted to. I wanted to. I sat on that deck every night with a glass of wine and did not think about Brianna Holt or Karen Holt or $80,000 or the careful new voice my son used when he was performing someone else's script. I thought about Robert. I thought about the early years, the small apartment, Daniel as a baby, the way the three of us had been a complete and sufficient world for a while. I let myself grieve that, not in a despairing way, but in the way you're supposed to grieve things, feeling the weight of it until it becomes something you can carry. Linda was good company in the way that old friends are good company. She didn't push. She cooked simple dinners and told me stories about her grandchildren and didn't ask me questions I wasn't ready to answer. But on the second evening, over pasta and the good bottle of wine she'd been saving, she asked me gently how I was thinking about Daniel. I told her honestly. I said I was afraid I'd already lost him. Not to Brianna, exactly, but to the version of himself he was becoming in her orbit. A smaller, more guarded, more managed version of my son. "You haven't lost him," Linda said. "He had lunch with you. He could have refused." She was right, and I knew she was right, and it mattered. The message from Brianna arrived on my second day at the cabin. It came as a text, and I want to describe its tone accurately because the tone was the whole point. It was warm. It was careful. It expressed regret that things had gotten so tense and a hope that we could start fresh. It said that Brianna valued family deeply. She used the word deeply, and that she wanted me to know the door was always open. There was no acknowledgement of what she'd said to me at the reception. No apology. No mention of the phone call where she'd threatened me with lawyers. Just warmth, manufactured and applied like a coat of paint over water damage. I read it twice. Then I put my phone down and watched a pelican fly in a long, straight line above the waterline. What did Brianna Holt want from that message? She wanted one of two things. Either she wanted me to soften and come back to the table on her terms, to let the $80,000 quietly resume its journey toward her bank account in exchange for a performance of inclusion, or she wanted to establish for the record that she had tried to make peace and I had refused. Either outcome worked for her narrative. I composed my reply carefully. I thanked her for reaching out. I said I also valued family. I said I thought a real conversation, in person when I was back in Salem, would be more productive than texts. I did not soften. I did not mention the money. I did not apologize. She did not reply. That evening, I told Linda about the message. Linda, who had raised 4 children and had seen her share of family politics, said something I've thought about many times since. The ones who want to get what they want and be loved for it at the same time are always the most dangerous. They can't stand being seen clearly. I think that was true of Brianna. She wanted the money, and she wanted Daniel, and she wanted to be the good daughter-in-law who had simply established appropriate boundaries. She wanted to be both the cause and the innocent party. And the only way I could stop her from being both was to stay clear-eyed and refuse to give her either the funds or the narrative. On my last day at the coast, Linda and I walked the beach for 2 hours. The tide was low and the sand was hard, and we walked further than we'd planned, talking about our children the way mothers do when they're being honest. Not the version you perform at dinner parties, but the real one, with all the fear in it. Linda told me about her oldest daughter's divorce, years ago, and how she'd learned the hard way that the most useful thing a mother can do in her adult-child's relationship crisis is remain steady. Not absent. Steady. Available without being intrusive. Consistent without being relentless. They come back to steady, she said. Eventually. They always come back to what doesn't move. I held on to that. I drove home to Salem on a Sunday evening with the windows down and the radio on. My house felt like itself when I walked in. The bookshelves, the roses visible through the back window, Robert's desk in the study. Whatever Brianna and Karen thought about who I was and what I could be made to do, they had not been inside this house. They did not know this version of me. I made myself dinner and called Tom Griffin in the morning to check in. He had heard nothing from any lawyers on Brianna's side. Her threat had been exactly what I'd assessed it as, a pressure tactic with no real weight behind it. He had, however, done some quiet research at my request. He had some things to tell me. I made an appointment for Tuesday. Tom's office was cool and still, the way professional offices are when the person inside them knows how to hold information before releasing it. He told me what he'd found. It wasn't criminal. I want to be precise about that. What Tom had uncovered was not something anyone would go to prison for, but it was illuminating. Brianna Holt, before she met my son, had been briefly engaged to another man, a software engineer named Garrett, who was by all accounts a kind and decent person. The engagement had ended, according to a mutual acquaintance Tom's paralegal had quietly contacted, approximately 1 month after Garrett's mother declined to transfer a significant sum of money toward a house purchase. The engagement dissolved. Brianna had moved to Portland shortly afterward. I sat with that for a moment. "It's a pattern," Tom said simply. I knew it was a pattern. Knowing it and having a second data point were different things. The second data point meant I was not paranoid. It meant I was not a grieving widow who couldn't let her son go. It meant what I had seen was real. I thanked Tom and drove home. That same afternoon, and I believe the timing was deliberate, that Brianna had somehow sensed the ground shifting in ways she couldn't fully see. I received a call from Daniel asking if he and Brianna could come by on Saturday. He said Brianna wanted to clear the air. He said it in a tone that was half hopeful and half rehearsed. I said yes. I said to come for lunch. I spent the rest of the week preparing, not dramatically. I cleaned the house, which I would have done anyway. I made a simple lunch, a good roast chicken, because Robert always said it was impossible to have a genuinely hostile conversation over a well-made roast chicken. And I decided what I would and would not say, and what I would not allow to happen. They arrived together, and together was the right word. Brianna walked in just slightly ahead of Daniel in a way that was probably not consciously calculated, but was entirely revealing. She had dressed carefully. Soft colors. Nothing aggressive. She brought flowers, which she handed to me with a smile that was almost convincing. We sat in the dining room. I served lunch. For a while, we talked about nothing. The drive down, the weather, a house they'd looked at in the suburbs. I watched Brianna navigate it and noticed the patience she was exercising. She was waiting for me to relax. She was waiting for the meal and the flowers and the soft colors to do their work. Then, over the chicken, she made her move. She said she'd been doing a lot of reflecting. She said she realized that her comment at the reception, she called it a comment, not a declaration, not a threat, had come from a place of anxiety about her new role in the family, and that she regretted it. She said she wanted Daniel's mother to feel included and loved, that she'd always wanted that. She said she hoped we could move past it, and then, smoothly, Karen's language. She mentioned that the house plans were on hold because of the uncertainty around the financial situation, and that it was causing Daniel stress. There it was. the flowers, the soft colors, the rehearsed apology, all of it leading here. Daniel was looking at me with something close to pleading in his eyes. He wanted this to be solved. He wanted the smooth surface back. I understood that. I loved him for it, and I pitied him for it at the same time. I put down my fork. I looked at Brianna directly and said, pleasantly and without heat, "Brianna, I appreciate what you've said, but an apology without accountability isn't an apology. You told me I was no longer part of this family. You've never said that was wrong. You've only said it came from anxiety." Her composure thinned, just slightly, just at the edges. "I'm trying to move forward." "I know you are," I said. "So am I. But moving forward doesn't mean pretending things weren't said. It means addressing them." "What do you want?" she asked, and the warmth in her voice had dropped a register. "An apology written in blood? Because I'm not sure what more you want from this." "I want you to tell Daniel what you told me at the reception," I said. "Not your interpretation of it. What you actually said." The room was very quiet. Daniel looked at Brianna. Brianna looked at her plate. And in that silence, I saw something shift in my son. A small, reluctant readjustment, like a calibration he didn't want to make but couldn't prevent. "Brianna," he said, "what did you say to her?" The temperature in the room changed. What followed was not a dramatic scene. Brianna didn't shout. She didn't storm out. She looked up from her plate and said very carefully that she may have said something that came across more harshly than she intended. "What specifically?" Daniel pressed, and I heard in his voice something I hadn't heard in 18 months. The man I raised, asking a direct question. Brianna looked at me with an expression that was no longer warm at all. "This is exactly what I expected from you," she said. "This is why this is so difficult." Then she stood up, told Daniel they should go, and within 3 minutes they were out of my house. Daniel paused at the door. "Mom," he said. He didn't finish the sentence. He looked at me for a long moment, and then followed his wife. I sat at the dining room table with the remains of the roast chicken and let out a long, slow breath. I was frightened. I want to be honest about that. Not of Brianna, not exactly, but of the momentum of it, of how long this could go on, of whether Daniel would keep choosing the comfortable version of events over the true one. But underneath the fear, something had happened in this room today. Daniel had asked her directly. Daniel had pushed back. That was not nothing. The fear was real. So was what it told me. I was close to something. I wasn't done yet. Garrett Morrow found me. I want to be clear. I did not contact him. Tom had identified him through background research, but we had agreed that reaching out was not something I should do. It risked appearing like I was building a case against my son's wife, which was not the kind of mother I intended to be. I had the information. I did not plan to use it as ammunition. But apparently, Garrett had heard, through the small social circles that connect people in ways they don't always realize, that Brianna was now married to a man whose mother had stopped a large money transfer. Apparently, that had struck a chord. He emailed me through my old school principal's address, which was still active. He introduced himself. He said he wasn't looking for anything. He said he'd spent 2 years wondering whether to reach out to someone in my position, and that he'd finally decided the answer was yes. He attached a brief document, a sequence of events from his own relationship with Brianna, written with the careful restraint of someone who had clearly written and rewritten it many times. The engagement, the house discussion, his mother's refusal to contribute $60,000 toward the purchase, the end of the engagement 4 weeks later. He said, "I don't know if this is useful. I just know I wish someone had told me." I printed it. I sat at Robert's desk for a long time after, looking at it. There is something specific about the feeling of being confirmed. Not vindicated, exactly, but confirmed. I had not invented a pattern. I had not been a grieving, paranoid widow who couldn't release her son. I had seen something real, and now I was holding it in my hands, printed on plain white paper, written by a stranger who had no reason to lie. I set it carefully in the folder with everything else and felt, for the first time since the reception, something that approached peace. I added it to my folder. The call I'd been waiting for came on a Thursday evening, 3 weeks after the lunch. It was Daniel, and this time his voice was different. Not the careful, managed voice of the past 18 months, but something raw. He said he needed to talk to me. He said he was coming over. He said Brianna didn't know. He arrived at 9 o'clock. He sat at the kitchen table and he looked like he hadn't slept well in days. He told me that since the lunch, something had been bothering him. That he'd asked Brianna again, in private, to tell him what she'd said to me at the reception. That she'd told him I had approached her first and made comments about her character. That he'd said, and here his voice broke slightly, that he'd said he didn't believe her, and that what followed had not been the conversation he'd expected to have with someone he'd been married to for less than 2 months. I didn't say anything yet. I let him talk. He said that he had found, on their shared laptop, he hadn't been looking, it had been open, a message thread between Brianna and Karen that he wished he hadn't seen. He didn't go into detail about everything in it. He said it was enough. I went to the study and got my folder. I put it on the table in front of him, and I sat across from him, and I said, I want you to read this, all of it. And I want you to know that I'm not showing it to you because I want you to end your marriage. I'm showing it to you because you deserve to know what's true. He read it slowly, the notes from the reception, the timeline of the past 18 months, Karen's phone call, transcribed with her exact words, Tom's research, and finally, Garrett Morrow's account. When he looked up, his eyes were red. How long have you had this? He asked. The notes from the beginning, I said. Garrett's email 3 weeks ago. Why didn't you? Because you needed to come to me, I said, not be brought. He was quiet for a very long time. I watched him sit with it, the way a person sits with something that reorganizes everything around it. Not a dramatic collapse, something slower and more honest than that. He pressed his hands flat on the table, looked at the folder, looked at me, and then looked at some middle distance that wasn't either of us. I had seen that expression before, on students who had just understood something they couldn't un-understand. The look of a mind revising itself. Then he picked up his phone and called Brianna. He asked her to come over. He said, and he said it with a steadiness I recognized as something inherited, that they needed to talk, and that it needed to happen at his mother's house. Because that was where it should have happened a long time ago. Brianna arrived 30 minutes later, and from the expression on her face when she walked in and saw the folder on the table, she understood immediately what kind of evening this was going to be. She tried several approaches. She tried the warm one, the composed, concerned voice, the we should all just talk calmly. When that didn't work, she tried the wounded one, the sense that she was being ambushed, that this was a coordinated attack by a mother who had never accepted her. When Daniel held up Garrett's account and asked her to explain it, she said it was completely different, that she and Garrett had been incompatible, that ending the engagement had nothing to do with money. Then why did it end 4 weeks after his mother said no? Daniel asked. She said the timing was coincidental. Daniel asked her about the messages on the laptop. She said he hadn't understood the context. Daniel said she could explain the context. She looked at me, not with the cold composure of the woman at the reception, with something more unguarded than that. A kind of frustration that happens when someone who is used to controlling the shape of a conversation realizes the shape has been decided without them. I had watched it happen in 30 years of school administration. The moment a person runs out of constructed responses and has nothing left but the unvarnished thing underneath. It is never comfortable to see, but it is always clarifying. She's been working against us since before the wedding, Brianna said, gesturing at me. Everything she's done. My mother canceled a bank transfer, Daniel said quietly. She wrote down what you said to her. She talked to a lawyer. That's not working against us. That's what you do when someone tells you you're not part of the family." He paused. "What did you say to her, Brianna? Not what you think she heard. What did you actually say?" The silence lasted long enough to answer the question. What followed that night was not the kind of dramatic, cinema-worthy collapse that people sometimes imagine when they think about confrontations like this one. It was quieter than that, more procedural. And in some ways, that made it more complete. Brianna did not confess to anything, exactly. She did not sit down at my kitchen table and admit to a strategy. But she also could not explain the Garrett timeline. She could not explain the messages on the laptop to Daniel's satisfaction. And she could not, in the end, produce a single credible version of what had happened at the reception that accounted for the detail and consistency of my written record. What she did was stop pretending. The warmth drained out of her face, and what was underneath it was simply exhaustion. The exhaustion of someone who has been performing a version of themselves for a long time and has finally reached the limits of the performance. She looked, for the first time since I had known her, like an ordinary person in a difficult situation, rather than a carefully constructed character. She told Daniel she needed to go home. He told her he'd be there later. She looked at him for a moment, and then she left, without saying anything else to me, which was in its own way the most honest thing she'd ever done in my presence. Daniel and I sat in the kitchen for another 2 hours after she was gone. We didn't talk the entire time. There were long silences that weren't uncomfortable. At some point, I made tea. At some point, he looked up at the photograph on the shelf above the window, the one of the 3 of us from a camping trip when he was 12. And he didn't say anything. But I saw his face do something I recognized. He said eventually, "I don't know what I'm doing." I told him I knew that. He said he didn't know if the marriage could survive this. I told him that was his decision to make, and that no one, not me, not Tom Griffin, not Garrett Morrow, could make it for him, and that whatever he decided, I would still be here. He said, "She told you that you weren't part of the family." "Yes," I said. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm sorry I didn't." He stopped. "I should have seen it." "You were in love," I said. "That's not the same as being foolish. It just takes longer to see clearly." He left around midnight. He looked like a man carrying something very heavy in a direction he hadn't planned to go, but he was walking upright, and he knew where he was going, and that was more than I'd had a month ago. 3 days later, Daniel called me to tell me he had spoken to a marriage counselor and that he was asking Brianna to attend with him. He said she had agreed, reluctantly. He said he wasn't sure what would come out of it, but that he needed a space where things could be said with someone neutral present. Karen Holt called me the following week. This call was different from the first one, shorter, sharper, with none of the diplomatic pretense. She told me I had damaged her daughter's marriage and that I should be ashamed of myself. I told her pleasantly that I had written down a statement made to me at a reception, had told my son the truth when asked directly, and had kept the control of my own finances. I asked her which of those things she'd like me to be ashamed of. She hung up. I called Tom and told him I would be keeping the $80,000 in my personal account. He confirmed what we both already knew. There was nothing in writing, no legal obligation, no case to be made. The funds were mine. I want to be clear about what I did and did not do with that money, because I think it matters. I did not spend it as a celebration. I did not put it into anything frivolous. I put $50,000 of it into a trust I had Tom draft, a document specifying that the money was available to Daniel for the purpose of a home purchase at any time he requested it, under his name only. Not jointly. His. The other $30,000 I donated in Robert's name to the after-school literacy program where he and I had both volunteered for years. It felt like the right thing to do with money that had been Robert's dream. The counseling sessions, as far as I know, did not save the marriage. I don't say that with satisfaction. I want to be honest that there is no part of this I enjoyed. Daniel is my son. His pain is my pain. But there is a difference between pain that is useful and pain that is simply the cost of truth, and I had learned to distinguish between them. By the end of that year, Daniel and Brianna had separated. It was not dramatic. It was the slow, reluctant kind of ending that most unhappy marriages actually have. A mutual exhaustion, a recognition that the shape of what they'd built together had been based, in part, on a foundation that couldn't hold weight. Daniel moved temporarily into my spare bedroom. That surprised me, and I want to be honest about that surprise. I had prepared myself for the possibility that he would blame me, that the version of events Brianna had worked to establish would outlast the confrontation in my kitchen. But he came here with 2 suitcases and a tired face, and we had dinner together, and he told me about his day, and I told him about mine. We rebuilt it. Carefully, the way you rebuild things when you've learned something about the materials, knowing their weight, their limits, what they can bear. The year that followed was the quietest and fullest year I had known since Robert died. Daniel found an apartment in Portland in the spring, a 1-bedroom with a good kitchen and a view of the West Hills, the kind of place a person chooses when they're choosing for themselves. He called me every Sunday. Not because he had to, not because it was scheduled, just because he wanted to. The calls were different from anything we'd had in years. Easy, wandering conversations about nothing in particular, the way good conversations are. He started therapy. He was, I think, more honest about this than most people are about the things they're working on. He told me directly that he needed to understand how he'd let himself be managed, and that he needed to do that work for his own reasons, not for mine. I was proud of him in a way that had nothing to do with him being my son, and everything to do with him being the kind of person who looks at himself without flinching. My own life had room in it now that had been occupied, for several months, by vigilance. I filled it with things I loved. I drove to the coast with Linda 3 times that year. I took an art class at the community center. Watercolors, which I was genuinely terrible at, but which I enjoyed with a completeness that surprised me. I spent more time in the garden with Robert's late roses, and I read more books than I had in years, sitting in the evening light at the study window. I was, unexpectedly, happy. Not the managed happiness of someone who has talked themselves into being fine, the real kind. I heard about Brianna and Karen through the ordinary channels that small towns and overlapping social circles provide, whether you want them to or not. The marriage counseling had, apparently, opened more than Brianna had expected. The counselor, working within professional ethics, not disclosing details, but unable to prevent the facts that emerged organically from conversation, had come to understand, as Daniel had, the general shape of how things had been constructed. The divorce proceedings were not, I was told, entirely smooth. Karen Holt, who had invested considerable energy in the strategy of her daughter's marriage, was not able to do much to protect it. The woman who had called me to collect money 4 days after a wedding, who had told me not to take too long, found herself in the position of watching a plan fail without any lever left to pull. I don't know what their relationship is now. I don't particularly need to. Garrett Morrow sent me a brief email some months after everything resolved. He said he was glad he'd reached out. He said he was doing well. I replied to thank him and wished him the best, and I meant it. Tom Griffin, at our final meeting on the matter, told me with his usual restraint that he'd rarely seen someone handle a complicated family situation with more clarity. I told him I'd had a good teacher, that Robert had always said the most important thing was knowing what you were actually looking at. Tom nodded and said he thought Robert had been right. The trust for Daniel's home purchase sits waiting. He knows it's there. He's not ready to use it yet. He told me once that he needs to feel like whatever home he buys because he chose it, not because he was moving away from something. I understand that. It will be there whenever he's ready. There is a Sunday photograph I keep on the shelf above the study window. The 3 of us from a camping trip when Daniel was 12. Robert sunburned and cheerful. Daniel with a gap in his front teeth that disappeared by 8th grade. Me in a green jacket I'd completely forgotten I used to own. The light in the picture is late afternoon, the particular gold of summer's end. I look at it sometimes when I'm at the desk, not with sadness mostly, with the feeling that comes from knowing what you have and what you kept and what it cost. People ask me sometimes if I regret any of it. I don't. I regret the pain it caused Daniel, but I don't regret staying clear-eyed, or keeping the money, or writing things down, or refusing to disappear quietly when someone decided I was inconvenient. Here is what I learned. Love is not proven by giving people whatever they want, and family is not ended by the declaration of someone who never truly understood what the word meant. What would you have done? Would you have transferred the money and kept the peace? I'd genuinely like to know. Leave a comment. It matters more than you think.